Hello and welcome to Professor M Explains. I am excited to deliver the content to you today with regards to developing conflict competence. Now, I promised that I was going to keep these summary lectures to a minimum, and I'm going to stick to this promise in this video here so that I can minimize the conflict and increase my level of conflict competence when it comes to myself and my students in delivering a summary that summarizes the chapter, because of course you've read it and we've already begun to apply these theories and methodologies to our projects in class. So let's begin, and let me keep my promise to you to maintain this summary lecture under a certain threshold of time. Okay. So when we're talking about the summary of this chapter, we have defined conflict and we understand that there are different ways in which we can deal with conflict in both our professional and personal relationships. While we are learning the rhetorical application of all of these incredible theories on interpersonal communication, let's be honest, we've been meeting every week for 12 plus weeks, right? You eat, breathe, and sleep interpersonal communication now that you know its relevance and its importance in your life, right? So let's come up with a super easy way that was explained by Hugh and Gail Prather, which is super exciting. It's funny, but it's true. It's easier to remember what not to do than to remember all of the theories and rhetorical applications of what we've learned that are the fundamental basis directives of interpersonal communication. So let's refresh our memory on what not to do in resolving conflict. We want to make sure that we stay away from these areas in order so that we can resolve the conflict in our relationships. First, we never want to bring up the matter when at least one person is angry. Never want to do that. We also want to make sure that we are not personal when we're setting forth the problem. This example we discussed is like taking that personal jab, taking that low blow, saying something to someone that you know will get under their skin and will really serve as just something to aggravate them, to dig in the conversation. Something else that is funny that this couple talks about in the magic rules of ruining any discussion is the fact that you don't want to just concentrate on getting what you want, and you want to make sure that you are listening to their needs instead of listening, thinking only of what you're going to say next in rebuttal to their exchange and communication. If you want to ruin the conversation or the conflict, you want to increase the conflict, go ahead and correct anything that your partner or the other person in the exchange of communication says about you. When you correct, you escalate, okay? I'm also mentioning anything from the past that has a chance of making the person on the other end of that communication exchange defensive. And lastly, ending by saying something that will never be forgotten is a surefire way to escalate conflict and to decrease your conflict competence in the exchange of that communication. So while we emphasize that conflicts are emotionally relevant, disagreements between independent people, we also must understand that while conflicts may be caused by a variety of things, all conflicts have an emotional component that must be considered in order for us to have a level of managing and enhancing that relationship outside of that conflict. Conflict is not inherently good, nor is it bad, and we learned that in this chapter. But the method of managing conflict can create dysfunctional or functional conflicts. We need to make sure that we're able to develop conflict competencies that encourage us to use conflict management orientation styles and tactics that encourage functional conflicts. To the extent that we can avoid creating hostile and defensive climates, it's important that we increase our chances of becoming effective conflict managers in both our personal and professional relationships. So, what we typically believe is that avoiding conflict, we touched upon this in our cultural identity chapter, where some cultures avoid conflict altogether. But when you're talking about a professional or even a personal relationship, some conflict is good. Okay, so we're going to touch upon the nature of conflict. Let's see if I can get my slideshow here too. Here we go. The nature of conflict, emotion and conflict and a fundamental link, a positive conception of conflict, the development of conflict competency, and the climate and conflict interaction. And lastly, approaches to conflict management. So let's just skim over this because, again, you've read this chapter and we've even started applying conflict resolution in earlier sessions when we brought conflict in that some of you all have been so gracious to share, and we've been able to process and come to a resolution to some of the issues that you've been dealing with as students in the college setting. So thank you for that. So now we are on the chapter that actually talks about what we've been applying for the last few weeks. The nature of conflict. Conflict is defined as the expression of a disagreement between two or more independent people about what should be done or how it should be done. Now, interestingly enough, we know that conflict has a negative connotation, but not all conflict is bad. You know, communication creates conflict, it reflects conflict, and it also manages conflict, which is super important to understand. There are three types of goals in measuring conflict. When we are measuring conflict, we need to make sure that we understand that there are three simple principles of interdependence and conflict. Conflict emerges when expectations for interdependence are violated. When we have a conflict with another person, it's usually that we expect the other person to fulfill our needs and he or she does not, or they do not. The more we expect from that person, the greater the chance is that that person will be disappointed or you'll be disappointed. Another perspective, a simple principle of interdependence and conflict to understand is that the more interdependent the relationship is, the more likely it is that you will have conflicts. The third principle, it's important to know about the interdependence and conflict connection, is how conflict is managed affects the interdependence in the relationship. If conflicts are managed constructively, then this interaction may strengthen the relationship, encouraging closer ties and more interdependence. Now, there are also different sources of conflict. Recall our chapter discussions talking about the disagreement on how to allocate scarce resources. There may be disagreements about who has the right to control a particular situation, or even how to treat someone with respect. When you also have goals or outcomes that are being placed before people in a conversation and the achievement of that goals, there may be a disagreement about how the goals or outcomes should be achieved. So understanding that when we think about other aspects of our definition of conflict concerns, the reason that people have conflicts or disagreements could come from any possible area that I've just provided examples to. Now, in the beginning of conflicts, we have prospective goals. Prospective goals are things that we want to achieve prior to engaging in the interaction. During the conflict, we have transforming goals. Transforming goals are goals that change based on what is happening in the conflict. And finally, after the conflict is finished, we have retrospective goals. These are goals that we think we had for the conflict, but we really didn't. Sometimes retrospective goals may seem like rationalizations or impression management. Now, this is when we're talking about the goals and the outcomes. And also another example are disagreements about the process, procedure, and methods to get desired outcome. So it's important to understand that in reviewing the nature of conflict, understand the definition, understand that communication inherently creates, reflects, and manages conflict. And then there are three types of goals in measuring conflict. Conflict is emotionally defined. It has levels of emotional and intensity, and it reveals our values and is tied to our identity. We have talked about the emotional and conflict link and how fundamental it is in developing your personal constitutions, what boundaries you're going to set in terms of your interpersonal communication, and how that plays out in the expression and the protection of you as an individual, processing and being a part of that communication process of the sender, receiver, the message, and the noise. Conflict is emotionally defined. It is revealed in our values, and it's strongly tied to our identity. When we talk about conflict in social media, there are different theories, there are models to support the model of media and social conflict. Make sure that you review those. Excuse me. But understand that at the end, the theories of connectivity, community, the identity and emotional drivers, the escalatory tendencies, and the resolution and reconciliation, is all a part of the process of resolving conflict. A positive conception of conflict can be categorized as being functional or dysfunctional. An example of functional is representative by being open, honest, calm, energizing, and de-escalatory, versus dysfunctional concepts of conflict being closed, dishonest, deceitful, tense, uncomfortable, proliferated, rigid, draining, escalatory, intractable. Okay. So make sure that you understand that there is a distinction between conflict, and while conflict is neither good nor bad, the ways in which conflict is handled can be destructive or constructive. When you move into your professional career, and you may have already experienced this, where you're working with teams, you are going to have high performance teams somewhere in your career that you will be a part of. And understand that when teams come together, conflict is prevalent. Conflict is not always bad. In the midst of conflict are disagreements on, again, what we talked about before, how the goals of the team should be structured, the driving force of the team, perspective and transforming goals, retrospective goals. When we talk about how to allocate scarce resources, many of our corporations and companies that you may find yourself interning with over the break or in between semesters have budget restrictions, disagreement about how to allocate scarce resources, again, is a conflict. But understand that when you are dealing with conflict can be good, because in the midst of conflict, creative juices flow, and people tend to think outside of the box when coming up with a solution to the conflict or the challenge. Just know that on the back end, how you handle an ability to control a situation or allocate resources comes down to, again, whether you categorize this conflict as being functional or dysfunctional. How you approach that conflict is extremely important. The development of conflict competence occurs in the cycle of practicing and experiencing this and understanding the basis of how you've developed your competency in dealing with conflict. Of course, after you finish studying, reviewing, testing, and applying this chapter, you're going to have a heightened level of conflict competence. Perhaps your patience level will grow and you will stay engaged in the method, in that exchange in which you find yourself in a situation that is labeled as being a conflict situation. But do understand that conflict competency begins in early childhood, and children learn how to be more independent through conflict. Also understand that the conflict competency is also tied into your cultural identity. Okay. And when we talked about those categories, if your culture teaches you to not express your individual feelings, your individual goals, and the attributes that make you, you're going to take that and it's going to translate into your level of conflict competency and how you are able to deal with conflict. If you're in a high performance team and you're working as a group on a project, do you shut down? Do you withdraw? Do you withdraw from the resolution on the process of where you see other people being practicing functional or dysfunctional traits or tendencies? Again, does your culture tell you to zip it and let everyone else handle it and you just be submissive to the process? Without going into too much other, rhetorical concepts on strategic development and leadership, again, I want to make sure that you are able to take interpersonal communications and apply it to your internship or your job that you'll have over the break. But understand that sometimes conflict competency and what we learn in early childhood is connected to a theory called group theory, where we don't express our ideologies and our opinions in resolving the conflict. We silence ourselves, our contribution to the process, and in that group theory notion, we go along with the majority of the group. You may see this in airline stewardess strikes. You're striking because the union is striking. You're striking because we're in our city that has, our state that has unions. So you may not agree with the union striking, but you have to because you want to keep the conflict at a minimum. Understand again that there is a tie-in between your cultural identity and early childhood competency levels and how you were raised. Does have a direct impact on your level of competence, of conflict competence. Too many C's, right? Also, let's know that there's a relationship between interpersonal negotiation strategies. How you come to the conflict resolution is dependent on 4 levels of interpersonal negotiation strategies that we learned in our text. Impulsive, unilateral, reciprocal, and collaborative strategies. Let's remember that as we're understanding the development of conflict competence. Lastly, conflict resolution education is extremely important when we understand that sometimes we need a little help to resolve conflict. And that's plugging in to other sources to help us resolve conflict. Want to take a moment to go over to climate and conflict interaction. Do understand that there are certain climates, and the climates that we create impact our conflicts. When values are attached, for example, in a protest for racial equality, people need to make sure that they strive to balance and maintain peaceful climates. Climates can be hostile. There can be microaggressions in conflict. There can be defensive climates and supportive climates. When we think about hostile climates, we can juxtapose that example to what we've seen in the media with the Pennsylvania elections or the elections across the country. Some states, the voters experienced and reported hostile climates, and that they felt uncomfortable and even going to vote. So understand that there is an attribution cycle that we discuss in our chapter, where it's a connection between the hostile attribution of behavior, global negative assessment, the search for conforming evidence, the discovery of conforming evidence, and then the justified retaliation. Then the behavior occurs. Again, when we're talking about conflict competence in hostile climates, microaggressions in conflict, defensive climates, we are looking at different areas where we act collectively, where people may be aggressive in different ways. Forms of aggressions are categorized, and between verbal aggression, physical aggression, social aggressions, it all requires a level of conflict competence. There are approaches to conflict management. Yay. There are orientations to conflict management, and there are three general approaches, right? No one wants to live in an environment or community that's full of microaggression, hostilities that people can't seem to resolve or find a resolution to. There are three general approaches to managing conflict. There's the integrative approach, the distributive approach, and the avoidance approach. There are a wonderful list of avoidance tactics, integrative tactics, and distributive tactics. Avoidance tactics are stalling, abstract remarks, procedural remarks. For instance, the communicator focuses on the way the discussion is going, not on the issues. We also understand that with integrative tactics, in talking about that, there are examples of concessions where the communicator indicates a willingness to give a little, or understanding, the communicator indicates understanding concerns. But the distributive piece of tactics, when we understand styles of managing conflict, personal criticism example is where the communicator faults the other person's character, or rejection where the communicator dismisses the other person's ideas, or even threat, blame, hostile remarks, and shouting are distributive tactics. When we're talking about the importance of continuing to understand the styles of conflict management, there's a difference between being concerned for yourself, being concerned for others. Understand that balancing dichotomy. And in Thomas and Kilman's conflict styles, there's competing and avoiding versus collaborating and accommodating on that scale of being concerned for yourself versus being concerned for others. But in the middle, in the central focal point of this need to resolve conflict and the approaches of conflict management is compromising. Understanding that both sides are important, and in a style of compromising, collaborating, and problem solving, with that being on one end and competing and avoiding being on the other end of the spectrum, compromising is a style of conflict resolution that involves bargaining or trading. Each person gives up or trades off something to get a part of what they want. Many people view compromising as the best way to resolve a conflict. However, neither person gets all of what they want, but the outcome is always somewhat a lose-lose or a win-win, depending on how you look at the glass. Either it's half empty or half full. There's also an important notion of understanding that understanding the conflict dynamics and the profile conflict and behavior assessment that is in our text. With this profile, there are three collective levels. Of course, there's the conflicts dynamic profile, which balances styles versus behavior, and it's categorized as constructive, destructive, and hot buttons. Do understand that constructive behavior scales, destructive behavior scales, and hot buttons are super important to know and review if you want to manage conflict or if you want to escalate that conflict. Okay. And when we are looking at the end of our chapter, there are dispute resolution tiers in both professional and personal exchanges in resolving conflict. But do know that while conflict competence is extremely important, it is balanced against the importance of emotional intelligence and emotional competence. Without the three, you're going to have failed results, and you're going to have breakdowns in logical argument, a lot of fallacies in presenting your side. And you want to make sure that you understand the importance and the connection of those three pieces in resolving any interpersonal communication issues that you may have. Thank you so much for joining me for the summary of this chapter. I can't wait to move on to the next chapter with you. Bye for now.